From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this presentation today. And I want to thank you for taking the time to pause and to think about a central figure in the March on Washington as we celebrate the 50th anniversary. I'm Eric Eldridge, an EEO specialist and ADA coordinator in OIC, the Office of Opportunity, Inclusiveness, and Compliance. OIC functions across the Library of Congress to address issues of discrimination, mediation, accommodation, and inclusion. And so with several employee organizations, we recognize the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and the life and work of Bayard Rustin. In the present day, OIC understands and leads activities which explores the essential understanding of social identities and the issues essential for today's world and workforce. As we look at Bayard's work, we can look at questions that are important to us in this focus. Does it matter that I'm gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, black, young, old, new, or seasoned in my work? Is my contribution to the work that I do overshadowed or undergirded by my identity and heritage? And what is more important, my label or my labor? Our curator, facilitators, panelists today provide research that speaks to all of these questions. And with that, we will begin our program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I am Michelle Chisholm, President of the Library of Congress Chapter of Blacks in Government, LC Big. Earlier this year, we were fortunate to have a presentation by Mandy Carter, a tireless activist for justice who brought a program about Bayard Rustin and clips of a documentary, Brother Outsider. We also presented, thanks to Adrienne Cannon, a tabletop display of related materials from the massive collections here at the Library of Congress. Those items inspired today's program. The Library of Congress Chapter of BIG has been very active in co-sponsoring programs with other recognized employee organizations, and we realize the power and synergy of working together across identities and issues. The impact we have in the lives of each other cannot be underestimated. We can hold each other back, or we can lift each other up. Bayard Rustin is an example of the someone who lifted us all up and brought us closer to Martin Luther King and to the dream. I would now like to present our facilitator, Sharon J. Letman Hicks from the National Black Justice Coalition. Sharon, please join us.
I am not Sharon. I am so sorry. Sharon will be up in just a moment. But before Sharon is here, I just wanted to say a little something. My name is Erin Hawkins. I'm the chair of LC Globe, and LC Globe is the Library of Congress's LGBT Employees Association. We focus on issues of awareness, education, and networking for LGBT individuals and our allies. Here at the library. And again, like Michelle said, we're just so proud and to collaborate with all of these wonderful organizations, BIG, OIC, Daniel A. Murray, African American Cultural Association. Bringing communities together was something that Bayard believed in, and we are stronger together when we advocate for our causes than we are apart. So again, like Michelle said, this is just a wonderful organization to get a chance to look at all of these things. And I also feel really privileged to have gotten to work with so many people from all of these different groups. I wanted to thank Lage Carlson for his work on the photography, which you're going to see. He took the images of the collection items, and actually Brock Thompson, who is our previous president, and all of our panelists has been, I look forward to seeing everything that you have to say, and of course Eric Eldridge, who has worked tirelessly on this, so I appreciate that. I think Sharon is up next. Thanks.
Good afternoon. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with so many brilliant minds and archivists to share in this auspicious occasion. As one of the chief architects of the civil rights movement and the brilliance behind the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Bayard Rustin's indispensable contributions to the ethos of our country continue to reverberate and push us toward a more just and fair society. America is indebted to Rustin, and our nation is right to finally honor him for his stalwart courage and leadership. Rustin was a radical visionary, a Black gay activist for freedom and peace during a time when the conditions of both these identities were perilous. That he lived at the intersection of these identities while fighting for the freedoms of all oppressed people is even more revolutionary. Rustin owned his power as a Black, openly gay man to fiercely challenge the status quo and fight on behalf of the oppressed and marginalized, while at the same time refusing to be identified by any single aspect of his identity. Rustin was as unapologetically Black as he was gay, and by his very presence challenged the evils of homophobia and racism throughout his life. His legacy leaves a salient lesson for us on the power of living authentically. However, in spite of all that Rustin was able to achieve on behalf of justice and equality, racism and homophobia has long clouded the narrative of Rustin's work. It erased him from our history books and stymied the proper celebration of his contributions to our country. It was Shiro activist Mandy Carter who really pushed us at the National Black Justice Coalition to take a closer look at our social responsibility as an organization that deals with the intersectionality of racial justice and LGBT equality every day. And when Mandy calls, you listen. And I am proud that the National Black Justice Coalition has remained dedicated to giving voice to Rustin's history of social justice, organizing, and strategy. Our work at NBJC is a testament to the spirit of Rustin's life, inspiring Black LGBT people to own their power and teaching others how Black LGBT people navigate space at the intersection of their identities. Rustin dedicated his life to the pursuit of human rights and justice for all in a dynamic and selfless way, and has verily earned his space in the history books. Our dream is that more will come to know of the great Bayard Rustin and will use the lessons of his life to make the world a more just and welcoming place. On behalf of the National Black Justice Coalition and the Black lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, I applaud President Barack Obama for giving the late Bayard Rustin the national esteem and recognition he deserves by awarding him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We have come a long way. And now it's up to people like you, my organization, and other amazing people who understand the importance of history to take these bodies of work into the field, to make sure academia understands, to make sure that classrooms understand, teachers, and the next generation on what true history is about. And history should not be altered due to social prejudice. And now I will turn it over to this brilliant panel, and Adrienne Cannon will take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Cannon. I'm the African American History and Culture Specialist in the Manuscript Division, and I'm also the curator of the Bayard Rustin papers. I would like to preface the introduction of the overview with some background information about the Bayard Rustin papers and related collections. In August 1964, Librarian of Congress L. Quincy Mumford wrote to A. Philip Randolph, the African American labor and civil rights leader, inviting Randolph to designate the Library of Congress as a repository for his personal papers. Following the librarian's letter of October 22, 1964, Daniel J. Reed, Assistant Chief of the Manuscript Division, visited A. Philip Randolph in New York City to discuss the deposition of his personal papers and the records of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the union Randolph founded in 1925. No commitments were made at that time, but both parties agreed to talk further. On September 8, 1966, another representative of the Manuscript Division, Paul T. Heffron, the 20th century political history specialist, visited A. Philip Randolph in New York City for a second time. Also present at the meeting was Randolph's colleague and confidant, Bayard Rustin, executive director of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, an AFL-CIO supported organization that Randolph and Rustin co-founded in 1964 to serve as a bridge between the Black community and organized labor. The long association of A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin began in 1941 when Rustin joined Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, to organize a mass march on Washington by thousands of African Americans to protest discrimination in defense industries and the armed forces. When President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, banning racial discrimination in defense industries, the march was canceled. In 1948, Rustin became the director of Randolph's Committee Against Discrimination in the Armed Forces, which helped secure President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, banning segregation in the military. He joined Randolph in organizing the prayer pilgrimage of 1957 and the youth marches for integrated schools in 1958 and 1959. The 1963 March on Washington was the culmination of the march Randolph and Rustin planned 22 years earlier. In 1966, Rustin collaborated with Randolph on the Freedom Budget, a 10-year program to end poverty in the United States. And in 1968, both supported the New York City Federation of Teachers strike against the Ocean Hill-Brownville Community School Board. Rustin's tenure as executive director of the A. Philip Randolph Institute ended in 1979. He served as chairman of the Institute's board from 1979 until his death in 1987. Randolph valued Rustin's friendship, counsel, and his native talents as an organizer and strategist. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters records were given to the library by A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood in 1971. The A. Philip Randolph papers were acquired by the library in 3 installments. The first installment came to the library as a bequest from Randolph via A. Philip Randolph's Educational Fund in 1983, and the second as a gift from the fund also in 1983. And the third was purchased in 1984. The papers were prepared by Bayard Rustin for transfer to the library per Randolph's instructions. The Bayard Rustin papers were presented to the library between 1988 and 1994 as a bequest via Walter Nagel, the executor of Rustin's estate. Some of the papers were held back to allow Jervis Anderson, a staff writer for The New Yorker, to complete the research for his biography. The Bayard Rustin papers span the period 1942 to 1987 and document Rustin's leading role as an activist in the pacifist movement, civil rights movement, and as an advocate for international human rights and social reform. The collection includes correspondence, memorandum, reports, financial records, speeches, and other writings in printed matter. Finding aids offering detailed descriptions of the Bayard Rustin papers, A. Philip Randolph papers, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porter records are available online via the Manuscript Division's webpage, www.loc.gov/RR/MSS. Prior to transfer to the library, the Bayard Rustin papers were microfilmed by University Publications of America, a commercial publisher. The Library of Congress holds the microfilm edition of the Bayard Rustin papers, along with 36 other libraries. The Bayard Rustin papers are also available online via ProQuest History Vault, a subscription database. The papers have produced 4 biographies: Jervis Anderson's Bayard Rustin, Troubles I've Seen, 1997, Daniel Levine's Bayard Rustin and the Civil Rights Movement, 2000, John D'Amelio's Lost Prophet, The Life and Times of Bayard Rustin, 2003, and Gerald Podard's Bayard Rustin, An American Dreamer, 2009, as well as 3 collections of writings, and have served as a source for the documentary film Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin, produced in 2002 and aired on PBS in 2003. Now we'll proceed to a quick review of the items that I selected for the tabletop display for Mandy Carter's talk on June the 5th. And the first item these are autographed letter by Julia and Jeff Rustin, Bayard Rustin's grandparents, as well as the next item that you'll see will be a letter by A.J. Musty. And both letters concern Bayard Rustin's imprisonment for being a conscientious objector during World War II. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph introduced Rustin to A.J. Musty. He was the executive director of the American branch of the Fellowship for Reconciliation, or FOR, a Christian pacifist organization dedicated to racial justice, which was founded in England in 1914. Rustin served as FOR Secretary of Student Affairs and Secretary of Race Relations from 1941 to 1953, and Musty, like Randolph, was a mentor to Rustin, and Rustin actually served. He was sentenced to federal prison for 3 years, and he actually served 28 months. We'll proceed to the next items. Okay. This is a report on the Journey for Reconciliation, 1948, which launched the first freedom rides into the South. It was organized by the Fellowship of Reconciliation in 1947 to test the new law prohibiting discrimination in interstate travel set by the Supreme Court's decision in Morgan v. Virginia in 1946. And this was co-written by Bayard Rustin and George M. Hauser of the Congress of Racial Equality. Next item is a typed letter of Bayard Rustin to Martin Luther King Jr. concerning the upcoming prayer pilgrimage for freedom at the Lincoln Memorial on May the 17th. This was written May the 10th, 1957. In 1956, Bayard Rustin helped Martin Luther King Jr. organize the Montgomery bus boycott. For 7 years, Rustin served as a special assistant to King. In 1957, at King's request, Rustin devised the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in collaboration with Ella Baker, a former NAACP field organizer, and Stanley Levinson. The prayer pilgrimage was a mass rally of about 25,000 people organized to demand federal action on school desegregation and to demonstrate support for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. It launched SCLC, and it also included participation of A. Philip Randolph, the NAACP, and entertainers. The letter that Rustin wrote was to advise King on the contents of the speech that he delivered at the end of the event. The next item is a typed letter signed by Ella Baker to Bayard Rustin and Stanley Levinson concerning their participation in a Southern Christian Leadership Conference conclave to be held in Norfolk, Virginia on October the 2nd, 1958. In the summer of 1958, Ella Baker, the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was planning a major Southern Christian Leadership Conference conclave in Norfolk, Virginia. In the letter, Baker asked Rustin and Levinson for their participation and updates them on the planning. On September the 20th, 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. was stabbed in the chest by a deranged woman while autographing copies of his book, Strive Towards Freedom, in the Bloomstein's department store in Harlem. Ralph Abernathy delivered a message from King at the conclave that began on October the 1st and ran through October the 2nd. The next items are letters, autographed letter from Stokely Carmichael to Bayard Rustin, asking Rustin to write a letter of recommendation for Carmichael for the Russell Bull Scholarship awarded by the United Packing House Food and Allied Workers, and it's dated March the 4th, 1963. And then Carmichael enrolled in Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1960, and there he joined the Nonviolent Action Group, an affiliate of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had already begun participating in demonstrations organized by the Congress of Racial Equality in New York City before entering college. Carmichael was introduced to Bayard Rustin by Tom Kahn, a white undergraduate at Howard who was a member of the Students for Democratic Action and the Nonviolent Action Group. Kahn had worked for Rustin on the youth marches for integrated schools in 1958 and 1959 and was his first assistant on the 1963 March on Washington. In this letter, Carmichael asked Rustin to write a letter recommending him for the Rustin Bull Scholarship. Carmichael initially viewed Rustin as a mentor, but broke with him to pursue a militant black nationalist strategy. And then the next item is Rustin's letter of recommendation that he wrote for Carmichael for the Russell Bull Scholarship. A copy was sent to Russell Lassie, who served as the international vice president for the United Packing House Food and Allied Workers Union. The next item is a typed letter signed Julian Bond to A. Philip Randolph affirming the support and endorsement of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms, dated April the 1st, 1963. While a student at Morehouse College, Julian Bond led sit-in demonstrations against segregation and co-founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Bond served as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's communication director. In this letter to A. Philip Randolph, director of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Bond affirms the participation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the event in the absence of the organization's chairman, Charles McGrew, and also James Foreman, who were presently being held in jail for leading a demonstration in Greenwood, Mississippi. In 1963, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had launched a major voting registration drive in Greenwood, Mississippi. It was the largest such effort in the state. The next items are examples of the logistic notes that Bayard Rustin used to plan the March on Washington. Rustin was the deputy director, and as such was responsible for coordinating the staff, finances, travel arrangements, accommodations, publicity, and all-around logistics for the march. And the first, this is an autograph manuscript example. The first item was a typescript. Then this is the souvenir portfolio that was given to participants in the march by Louis Lowe Monaco. This is the reproduced eulogy that Rustin delivered for A. Philip Randolph, reproduced in the American Federalist and AFL-CIO publication. This is a letter that relates to Rustin's involvement in the African independence movement. It's written by William Sutherland to Rustin and to A.J. Musty. And it concerns the plight of the Rwandan people in Tanganyika, which became the Republic of Tanzania. And then the final item is a letter that Rustin sent to then Mayor Ed Cox concerning support for the passage of the New York City Lesbian and Gay Rights Bill, dated February the 25th, 1985. Rustin became an advocate for gay rights in the 1980s. This 1985 letter to Mayor Koch documents his involvement in the effort to extend New York City's human rights laws to cover sexual orientation. The first proposal for a lesbian and gay rights bill, Intro 475, was put before the City Council in 1971. The bill prohibited discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations. After a version of the bill finally passed in 1986, opponents moved to attach amendments that would weaken the new law. Rustin testified at a City Council hearing denouncing any changes. A copy of his statement is also included in the papers. And that concludes our introduction of the items. And now I will turn the discussion over to John Ashley, who will focus on Rustin's role in the March on Washington.
Right. Thank you, Adrienne. And thank you, Michelle, and the other co-sponsoring organizations for an invitation. I am John Ashley, a longtime Dungeons employee here at the Library of Congress. And very quickly, I have about 5 to 7 minutes to summarize and focus on what Adrienne has initiated, but also to focus on the many, many boxes of Mr. Rustin's papers that obviously Adrienne did not select for this. Her selection was for a very specific prior presentation by Ms. Carter. We are now adapting and adopting it to be used here today. So I'm sure that Adrienne would have made a very different selection had she time and cause. And perhaps at some later time we can do that. So what I have done is go down and wade through those many boxes and folders. First, because it's just neat to touch other people. And touching his papers was as close as I could get to touching the great man. And that was good enough for me. In addition, I will not rely on the many biographies of him and the many stories I've heard about him to make my presentation today. My focus is on our great collections here at the library and what they say about his role in the March on Washington. And I'll move quickly because 7 minutes obviously cannot summarize a decade of 77 decades of activism. Initial points. Do not expect the many boxes of papers to tell you all there is to know about his involvement with the March. And the March is the only thing I focus on. Obviously, the small ego that he had did not encourage him to keep records to the iota level of everything that he did. Unlike today's narcissistic times, he didn't do that. Leaders today do that, first because it's easier. Flash drives. If I send you an outgoing email, I've also kept a copy for myself. That was hardly true. His many outgoing letters were either handwritten or typewritten or postcards or telegrams or phone calls. And so a lot of his brilliant contribution would be reflected in the boxes and papers of those peoples to whom he corresponded. So a good historian would start here at the Library of Congress, wade through those many boxes, and know that the job has just begun. That's a simple point, but the most profound point. Don't expect this box to these series of boxes to overwhelm you. And a related corollary, do not let the paucity, the apparent paucity or paucity, underwhelm you. Because you should know that there's much more. For example, second point. We know from Adrienne's good summary and very, very hurried presentation that the March on Washington did not just automatically and magically happen. It had been a dream, if you will, of other men other than Mr. King decades before it happened. So though attributed to Mr. King and others of more prominent stature, the idea conception, the conceptualization of the March was something that Mr. Rustin and Mr. Randolph had been working on really for decades and had rehearsed with the many, many smaller but yet important marches that Adrienne summarized for a variety of different purposes in a variety of different places. So already we can see his significant contribution even before we got to the great day in 1963. Which is why, and this is the third point in looking at the papers, not just the ones that Adrienne has presented, especially the two that are just logistical papers that Adrienne presented, handwritten notes. You will find in the manuscript collection many, much evidence that he actually administered nearly every phase. So beyond the concept stage for the March, there's the administrative stage. How do you get it done? Well, his papers indicate that he wasn't always on loan to get the March done. Mr. Randolph had to make special plea to the War Resisters League to get him from there to here. Why? Because he was doing such a brilliant job with pacifism and anti-war efforts that he had to be borrowed. He was that much in demand. And his papers give some sense of how it was arranged, but it doesn't give you the entire picture. It tells us that he was working with War Resisters League. A call went from Mr. Randolph requesting that he be brought on loan to get the march going. The initial request was turned down because he was too important. They simply couldn't afford him. to be away for months at a time, and then ultimately, magically, the papers show that he's there now, working hand in glove with Mr. Randolph. Well, that transition from how the loan happened and how the formal arrangement happened is a gap in his papers. But it is explained somewhere. So a good historian again begins with our manuscript division and then proceeds to look at the Randolph papers and other papers at the War Resisters League. Because the complete picture of a non-egotistical, brilliant man is you don't spend time thinking about yourself. And so you aren't keeping records for history. And so as historians, we piece it together. So once he's on board, we find that magically, but not surprisingly, the development for the march begins to take place. He's immaculately well detailed, organizing committees, committee reports, thinking about expenditures, thinking about programs, renting microphones, bills of sales for engaging in transactions that rent microphones, tape recorders, stenographers, arranging RSVP invitations for Congress, helping to create travel logs and arranging and giving information to the many buses and cars and travelers that would come to Washington. Well, for example, his manuscript papers, division papers indicate that he'd done his research. Which bus tours from, for example, Newark, Delaware would give you the best rates? At what time? And when did they discount if you rented an entire bus? He researched that information, compiled it, and made it available to the many city and state networks and headquarters that he and others had organized to help arrange and get people to Washington. So his papers indicate minutia of detail at the most minute level, a man understanding, because he had rehearsed it before many times before, how to get the job done. Now, once he's on board, obviously, well, perhaps not so obviously, the planning for the march really picks up. They had originally planned the march, his paper tells us, in the early spring. Well, that wasn't going to happen because it was already near that time. So then for a series of reasons, the paper tells us those reasons, but they're not important here today, it gets delayed until when it actually does happen. It really was supposed to be later in the fall, and then they move it up to August for a number of reasons. So he's involved in helping a larger committee on which sat and served Mr. Randolph and Dr. King, the final and ultimate decision of lobbying, bartering with many folk to figure out exactly when the timing would be. So now he's only got a few months to get all of this done. How can it be gotten done so quickly and so successfully as we know now it did? Well, he must have worked 27-hour days, because it meant really doing in a small space in August in Washington, D.C. weather, many things. His papers tell us that he met with Metropolitan Police and Park Service police people. He actually trained some of them on crowd control and maneuvers. It would have been easy for the crowd to be unruly or law enforcement people to be unruly. Knowing that from prior marches and rehearsals, he was able to teach how he wanted this to happen. He taught them. So when we are amazed that it went off so well, there are a lot of good reasons for that. A lot of good people, including every attendant, wanted it to happen. But also because those people, such as Mr. Rustin, gave their time. Someone tell me when 7 minutes is up. It's already up? No. Okay, then quickly, just 2 points. I've talked about the idea conceptual stage, the planning stage. I gave you a little hint. The administrative stage. There's a follow-up stage. Once the march has happened, there were great plans. Mr. Rustin knew this is only the beginning. And for him, it wasn't really even a new beginning because he'd done this before in smaller scale. He knew that the real profits of the success of the march was not just getting large numbers here, and by the way, his papers indicate that even he was surprised at the great numbers of people who came, and the great numbers of people who gave him 50 cents, 25 cents, $1, $1.25 to help finance the march. He kept all those records. He sent them all postcards thanking them. He returned checks when they received them too late to do whatever they were earmarked for. His papers indicate that. But also at the follow-up stage, his papers indicate that it was important that you follow up. Now, what's missing in the papers is you didn't really tell us what his follow-up was. He understood and he told folk, which they sent him thousands of emails and telegrams and other letters. Would that there had been email, we'd have a better set of papers here. As they sent him thank you letters, knowing that he was the reason for the success in the march, he responded back to each one. Not with individual letters, but with a template that was often modified slightly. And his template letter said follow-up plans, but he never told us what those plans were. So as a good historian, again, we begin here to figure out that he had other plans. We don't know what those other plans were. It is more likely and most likely that those other plans hopefully are reflected elsewhere in some other papers. NAACP papers, Congress of Racial Equality papers, National Urban League papers, the Randolph papers, but the job begins looking at his papers. I'll reserve the balance of my time. Thank you. Louis? Okay. I'll yield the floor to Louis.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Luis Clavel. I work here at the Library of Congress in the Office of Records Management. Very happy to be here and addressing you today. What an awesome, auspicious occasion of the 50th anniversary, and quite an interesting group of primary resources that I've been given as well to speak about. First of all, I'd like to thank Adrienne Cannon for all the work that she does in the Manuscript division. And of course, the NAACP papers are the most accessed, and that's helped researchers all over the world, and I personally admire her so much, along with all the people that made this day possible, Michelle and Eric and all the other members that are here at the panel. I have the very interesting topic to speak about, and that's the relationship between Bayard Rustin and Stokely Carmichael. In my opinion, two great revolutionaries. And on today, public speaking is quite cautious, but I hope that you give me enough space to speak about revolution and the idea that these two men represented something that's quite rare today. Today, people don't stand up against war. They don't get arrested for a cause. They don't get their heads bashed or continue this sort of unfearing quest for what we know is good. So today, we're reflecting on the day and on that activity. That's activism. That's when we're committed more than just talking over a beer at a bar. That's when we really face our biggest fears. And without any doubt, Bayard Rustin was a person that faced those fears without any fear from the beginning. And we talked about him a little bit early on as an organizer. Even in high school, he organized against bad food at his school. This is a man who basically, in the 40s, as it was said, started the whole movement. He started the idea of not being afraid to go to jail. During the time of the 40s and 50s, one of the most fearful things that a black person could do is go to jail. We have to get perspective about this, because going to jail is kind of cool now, if you think about it. Young people are kind of associating with the culture of jail in a completely different way, because if you were arrested in Georgia, you may lose your life. Okay, this is a different situation than it is now. We're going through a wartime that Bayard Rustin would be a big vocal contributor to peace and passivity. We know that he was a Quaker. We know that he stood on the passive principles enough to go to jail in 1942 as a conscientious objector about the war. And we also know that Stokely Carmichael was also against war, okay? Now, when we look at the revolutionary tendencies and approach between the two men, a lot of researchers say that they're different. They diverged at a certain point. And the more that I read the papers that I was giving to research, the more I started to ask myself more questions, because researching sometimes brings you some answers, but for me, brings me a lot more questions. And as I read the actual text of the two letters, and to really give you a better description, Stokely Carmichael wrote a letter to Bayard Rustin asking for a recommendation for a scholarship, the Russell Bull Scholarship, which was for an outstanding student associated with liberation struggle. He needed a recommendation from someone else associated with liberation struggle. Bayard Rustin wrote the recommendation. And when we read the letter from Stokely, who was later, of course, referred to as Kwame Ture, we see that his involvement throughout the summer of '63 and involving New York and core activities aren't as easily seen by just doing the research. And we also see that in his letter, he refers to the hospital committee and the strike of hospital workers, where he represented the Puerto Rican interest. And it's interesting because I'm an Afro-Puerto Rican, and I'm like, oh, wow, as we deal with primary resources in an institution like this, we really have an opportunity to find out so much more. Researchers and people who write leave out quite a bit of the story because they think it might bore you. Well, that particular part intrigued me and encouraged me to find out more. I think that what I really want to point out is some more things that are really similar between Bayard Rustin and Kwame Ture. And this morning, we affirmed that a struggle has existed and is in a continuum. So we have to look a little closely at what that struggle meant for people who were thought about as revolutionaries. And I think that as we look closer at it, we can examine the exercises and the right to vote. We can examine discriminatory practices. We can look at the criminal justice system a little bit more. We can be encouraged to be more of a participant. Right now, the issues between the lesbian, gay, and transgender groupings and the black movement and the idea of human rights has a wedge sometimes. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to look at and analyze the wedge. Why is there a wedge? And reading these letters made me realize that there really isn't much of a wedge when we look at it from the perspective that they had, and that was for workers. You see, there's a division going on based on class, race, gender, sexual orientation that divides workers in this country. And once we realize that that's the basis of who Rustin and Ture were, we can understand that some of the conditions really haven't changed as much for us to really commemorate and celebrate today, but to really reaffirm our connection with something that still is evolving, and that's our democracy in this country. Thomas Jefferson, who donated his books, was paid $23,000 for his books, that started the cornerstone of this institution after the War of 1812, said that there wasn't a subject that Congress didn't have to have reference to. And it even goes as far as making us think about being an informed public. We have to continually use resources and research so that we are able to make a stand and move this country forward towards a more greater and perfect union. And I think as we look at that, we see ourselves as one, as America, and as American people. And I'm so excited to share this moment with you and to share today with you. And I really think that Bayard Rustin was a complete visionary. He was somebody who stood without fear. He had the erudite brilliance to organize such a huge march. He raised $140,000.